screen and window. So please make use of that to assure you can see all of the content. We're talking about storytelling, so let me begin with the story. I got a call a few weeks ago from a client. One of the project managers had just sent his first feedback survey to a client. The client responded, and the responses were all very positive, except one low score regarding the project budget. The project manager called me wanting to know what to do next. He knew he was supposed to follow up, but wasn't sure how. I showed him where he could capture notes about his follow-up to the client and pointed him to a guide for dealing with the specific scenario. I suggested he might want to email the client first and let the client know he wanted to talk about the budget, which was the issue the client had raised. I said if the client's not expecting you to call, he might not be ready to give more detail or process the conversation. He might find it a bit confrontational, or I've even seen sometimes clients apologize for giving the candid feedback they gave. The project manager said to me, oh, well, you know, I'm not too worried about it. It's going to be fine. He's my best friend. I'll just give him a call. I checked in a few days later, and the project manager had called and had figured out what the budget problem was. And it wasn't actually a problem. The project was on track to complete within budget, but the client was concerned it might get out of control. After a good chat, they were both satisfied the outcome would be successful, and the scope and budget would remain on target. The project manager was able to assure his best friend, his client, that the scope was on track, the budget was on track, and the project was not at risk of going over budget, as the client was concerned. I just told you a story. The story shows how I helped a client, someone probably very much like each one of you. And in the story, I revealed a lot about what my business might be all about. Hopefully the story was compelling enough that you heard more than the blah, 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 here's what I do. And if I told it well, you might even have a few questions, which is great. We just started a conversation about how I might help you too. What do you say and how do you respond when someone asks you what you do? Or when they ask about your firm? How do your staff respond to questions like that? Do you share a long list of services and markets and segments and capabilities? Or can you tell a good story about how you can help them based on how you helped somebody else? How we describe what we do defines who we are. What's interesting is that there's probably 100 different definitions of what you do in a company of 100 people. We each have our own perceptions, and what we define as us reveals much about ourselves. But each of your clients has their own definitions of what you do as well. And you know what? They're all different. It's trickier still because the service you offer isn't something you categorize in words. It's not a belief or a religion or some intellectual construct. The service you offer is really an experience, especially when you're talking about the world of professional services. This isn't really something you explain or define or quantify. It's something you lived and felt. You know quality of service when you see it, when you feel it, when you hear it. Service quality is a really decidedly existential concept. Think about your personal experiences with quality. You walk into a hotel, you're tired and worn from travel, and you can feel it when the level of service is there. You don't think about it, you just know it. You might struggle to define exactly what it was that created that experience, but you can easily talk about how you felt in the experience. Your clients, when talking about you and your firm, are the same. They may not be able to define exactly what it is you did for them, but they can certainly communicate how you made them feel and what the experience of working with you was like. That's why it's critical to understand and share their stories. Only then can you truly understand the value you bring and how to communicate that value to others. Stories create learning and change. And I'm going to take you through that in detail today. But first, I want to share with you a short story about telling stories. There's a couple things we can learn from it. It's only 2 minutes. It's really kind of completely nerdy, but I know there's a lot of engineers here, so hopefully you'll ride along with me on this one. There's some really important ideas here. Video and audio aren't fantastic via a webinar platform, so it might be a little bit choppy, but stick with. It's only about 2 minutes, and we'll reconvene then.
Captain's log, stardate 45047.2. The Enterprise is en route to the uninhabited Eladrel system. Its location is near the territory occupied by an enigmatic race known as the Children of Tama. Children of Tama. In my experience, communication is a matter of patience, imagination. I would like to believe that these are qualities that we have, and what does it all mean? Darmok and Jalad. I don't know who or what Darmok or Jalad are, but I certainly didn't come here to start a war. They seem to communicate through narrative imagery, a reference to the individuals and places which appear in their mytho-historical accounts.
Into the romance.
Know how they think. Shouldn't we be able to get something across to them?
If I know, it wouldn't have any meaning.
Uzani, his army with fists open. An army with fists open to attack. That's how you communicate, isn't it? By citing example, by metaphor. Uzani's army with fists.
It was a fun little walk down memory lane for some of you. And if you weren't too distracted by the fact that we were just watching Star Trek, I hope you caught a couple of the purposes and themes in here. First, how many of you feel like talking with clients is often like what you just saw? It's almost like our clients are incomprehensible aliens at times. They speak a language, and it certainly takes patience and persistence to learn and understand them. The second point, though, and I think the more interesting point, is how the children of Tarma speak only in metaphor and allegory. What an amazingly rich way to speak. Think about how much is conveyed and communicated in a story. And yet storytelling is a lost art, especially in today's data-driven age. Storytelling used to be how knowledge was transferred from person to person, generation to generation. Rich oral histories and traditions were the core of our cultural evolution. We're human in many ways because of our capability to tell stories. So let's practice for a moment. If you have a pen and piece of paper in front of you, take a moment and see if you can't write down a 5-word story. And those of you brave enough to type it into the question chat, I'd love to see if any of you can come up with a 5-word story. You've heard the example, Julia on the balcony. Gosh, there's all kinds of stories you could share, something like Armstrong on the moon, or OJ in a white Bronco if you want to be a little more silly. There may be something like Kate and Leo on the bow of Titanic. You can pick from literature, film, TV, news, history, pop culture, or pull a story from your own organization's history. For example, I might say, a best friend's feedback. I just shared that story with you. Now you know it. And I have a concise reference for similar situations in the future. The next time we're working with a long-term loyal client and we're discussing whether we should get feedback because, oh, they'll tell us, all we have to say is remember that time the guy asked his best friend for feedback? It's a metaphor. It's a placeholder for this really important idea. And we all remember that story. We remember what we learned. Because I shared the story before, and we have a common language. That's now part of how we can communicate as a team. So we can take that lesson the one time and whittle it down to a very concise concept in a single breath. So have any of you written down a story? Anyone have time in the midst of this to share something? I'll post a couple into the question chat. I'd love to see some of those, and I'll share them along the way as we get there. Storytelling is critical because stories bring context and the meaning to the world and our experience in it. If we don't know the context, the story doesn't have any meaning. And without the story, the what we do every day lacks the why we do it. If you don't understand what's driving your clients, what's motivating them, why they need this building or bridge or road or environmental study, if you don't understand the why behind it, the what you do, this doesn't matter as much. So what would change if everybody in our firm began incorporating storytelling as a communication tool? If they could share examples. Yeah, a great example here. One of you love this story here. Pete Carroll, worst play call. What a great story from a recent memory here. And those of us who lived it and saw it and experienced the pain or jubilation, depending on which side of that play you were on, we could all relate and identify to that. And there's a comment here, designing what they want and what they need, which is, I think, a great point. Understanding really what the client's drivers are, what their goals and objectives are, and the story behind what they're going to do with this thing, why they're going to be there, how it helps support their organizational objectives. At the end of the day, what you do is only so important. Why you do it and who you're helping and why it matters to them creates a great deal of meaning for what we do every day. So why are these stories really so important? Well, for one, stories sell. There's a great advertisement I've seen. Here's a gum commercial, and a few of you may have seen this already. And this gum commercial, this little 30-second vignette, they don't tout the features and benefits of gum. They don't focus on flavor, texture, and hygienic benefits. It's a story of a dad giving his daughter a piece of gum. And he folds the wrapper into an origami swan, and scene after rapid scene, no scene lasting more than 3 or 4 seconds. Dad gives girl a piece of gum and folds the swan. And in the last scene, he's packing her up for college, and out drops a box of origami swans, and they spill all over the driveway. And in 30 seconds, Wrigley turned a piece of gum into life, into a picture of the ideal. They created a sense of being. And it really, at least for me, it created a vicarious experience. And I became a part of that story. I've got 4 young kids, including 2 daughters of my own. I've never made a chewing gum swan for any of them. But I could immediately relate. Being a dad is the incremental sum of all the little things we do every day. And while I've never made a swan out of chewing gum, and neither of my daughters have this box of wrappers, every little thing I do for them fills up a metaphorical shoebox that they'll each take with them when they move out. And this commercial, it reminds me to do the little things every day. And if one of those little things happens to be buying a pack of gum and sharing it with the kid, because there's no way a kid doesn't get happy with a little piece of gum, then Wrigley did their job. Some of the time, guess what? I'm going to buy Wrigley gum. That's a powerful story. And there's some deep, important emotional stuff there. That's a silly stick of gum. So what are your clients' stories when you can really find what's happening, what's motivating them, what's driving them, what's creating their purpose, why they get out of bed every day? When you can find those stories and understand them, and you can share them with others, it's going to help sell what you do, because it's going to show you get the why. You don't just get the what. Stories don't just sell, they last. What's this story that you see on the screen? It probably took no one longer than 1/4 of a second to figure out what story we were just talking about. This is, of course, the Trojan horse. The first histories of mankind were all oral histories. Before we had books and facts and metrics and Wikipedia and spreadsheets, we had people, places, plots, motives. We had antagonists and protagonists. And history was not forgotten because the stories are compelling. People love them. They remember them. They tell the stories to friends, to children, to peers. I took a lot of history in school, and while I may not remember the numbers and the facts and the dates and the places, I remember the stories and what was going on behind them, because the stories are compelling and they're interesting. So long after the data in your report is forgotten and irrelevant, the story behind the data will live on. If you aren't telling stories, your knowledge, all that effort, all that work is really temporary. I saw a keynote speaker at a conference last year, and I don't remember his name or exactly what he said, and I'm not even really sure exactly what all of his points were or why he was there. But he told a story about his life and how he had a pretty severe accident and ended up in a wheelchair. And I remember the story. And because I remember the story, I can reflect on it. And when I do, even if I don't remember exactly what I said, I can begin to remember his points and what he was talking about and why he was talking about it. So when you think about it, storytelling is really the original data compression algorithm. You've all heard a good picture or a good chart can be worth 1,000 words. Well, a good story is worth 1,000 charts. Once you have the story, you can compress it down in just the bare essence and re-communicate that idea over and over again very effectively. Stories also have tremendous power to reveal meaning for everyone. And if you look into history of all of the greatest teachers and the religious leaders, they were all great storytellers. They knew that stories were compelling. People lined up to hear them. They knew that stories lasted. But they also knew that stories reveal meaning and purpose time and again. Take any great literary work or any religious document, any parable, and read it again and again over the years. You know what happens? The same story, the same words, the same characters. They grow and change as you do. Their motives, their strengths, their flaws, they are all recast at each read because you have recast them. You've changed, and you understand differently this time. It doesn't mean the old meaning goes away, but the new meaning is revealed. The same story becomes something you learn from over and over and over again. Data doesn't do that. Data doesn't have a life and grow and change with you the way stories do. Think, for example, about the story of the prodigal son. Those of you who may know the story, at times I've read the story, and it's about a young son who grows up, takes his inheritance early, goes away, and just completely wastes it. And you read the story, and sometimes you identify with this young son, and it's this talk about the futility of a frivolous lifestyle and the need for humility as he crawls back home to seek forgiveness and reconciliation. And sometimes you read the same story, and you relate with this father, and you feel the father's loss. You feel the shame of your own failure to raise a wise son, and you connect with his joy as what is lost is found again. Sometimes you read the story, and you're this guy's brother, the self-righteous, indignant son who always stuck around and did the right things. And here's his father celebrating the return of a wasteful, lost son. You can read the story so many different times, so many different ways, and it will speak to you differently every time, regardless of your religious backgrounds and beliefs. That's what stories do. They transcend those boundaries, and they really connect with who we are. And the lessons that we learn from the stories will, again, begin to transcend time and place and reveal different meanings to different people in different ways. So the same story becomes a learning event you can learn from over and over and over again. So these stories, they not only help us sell, they not only last, they not only reveal meaning, but they really help shape how we present data and information. They begin to relate these rational sources of objective stuff that we have, the calculations and the sizes and the quantities and the places, and these extra rational sources, the emotion, the spirit, the feel, the purpose. So your client data, your client information needs a story as well. for the information you have about your clients to create change and benefit, for it to really inform the decisions and culture and process, this data, this information needs extra rational context. Emotion, passion, pain, joy, frustration, elation. Until the data has these wrappers, we'll never develop an appropriate empathy for the client. Now, without their story, we get too focused on the project, on the number, on driving our metrics. It really becomes an internal, selfish, and blinding perspective. But with the story, we're forced to understand the client. We have to face the fact that clients are humans, not numbers. They're irrational, they're erratic, they're fickle, they're challenging. Gosh, we all know how challenging they can be, and yet every one of them is a human being. And every one of them has an experience, and every one of them matters. And the stories help bring that into focus so that we, as individuals, as teams, and as organizations, can stay focused on what really matters. So if these stories have so much power, why don't we tell more of them? When was the last time you or a colleague told a story at work? When was the last time someone told a client story, a story about the service that you're delivering? It's no wonder we forget to put the client first. It's no wonder why we struggle to create client-first cultures. It's no wonder why new staff struggle to quickly get up to speed, and long-tenured veterans are tough to change. We've lost the art and the culture of storytelling. We rush headfirst into management systems and data mining and dashboards and metrics and utilization rates and all these other great things that we need, but we've left the stories behind. Now, don't get me wrong, I love data. I love metrics. I co-founded a company that helps firms gather client feedback and gather metrics and data to quantify the health of relationships. But the data doesn't do much good without context. The context comes from the stories. The stories work not just for the listener, but also for the teller. The storyteller has to first understand the story. He has to focus on what matters. You can't tell the story if you don't know the story. So when you start creating a storytelling culture, what you're doing is you're really holding your staff accountable. You're holding your teams and your people accountable to understand what's going on with the client, because they can't tell the story if they don't know. So the power of gathering and telling a story isn't just for external purposes, it's for the internal purposes. And when the storyteller can communicate a story clearly and concisely, not only is the teller engaging in the story with purpose, but the listeners, the audience, are also engaging with purpose. And we're all learning from it, and we're all owning it. So I've given you a good challenge here on the purpose and the power of stories. So now we're going to focus in on how do we find the stories. How do you find these layers of what's happening inside the client organization? And I'm going to suggest that conversations with clients is the only way to get started. Not just any conversation. You need to have a conversation about what the client experience really is. And asking for feedback starts great conversations. There's no better way to understand the client's experience than to ask how things are going. Why do you have to ask? Well, because talking about experience is not something that comes naturally or easy to most people. How many times have you sat across the client or across the table from a client during a meeting and felt like he was hiding something? Somehow he wasn't saying everything you wanted or everything you needed to hear to assure the project was on track. Do you remember the story I told a few moments ago? A project manager sent a survey to a client who happened to be his best friend, and discovered a low score, my goodness, they're best friends. If best friends will sit on critical information without telling you, what about all the rest of your clients? I've heard time and again, oh yeah, we've got great client relationships, so we don't have to ask. They'll tell us how things are going. But you see, people rarely confront a problem until the pain of living with the problem exceeds the pain of confronting the problem. And that means a lot of little things are sitting out there waiting to be discovered. Likewise, a praise that is often long overdue sometimes isn't forthcoming because there's no context for it. If you don't give the client a chance to say, well done, that's exactly what I was looking for, it's awkward sometimes to just bring it up because there's no time or place or context to do that. So think about it. How many of you are married or in some kind of a significant relationship? Think about that one thing you'd love to tell him or her. That one little bit of change they could do to make life together better. So I dare you, go home and tell them. And if you're feeling a bit uncomfortable right now, don't worry, I've got my own list because it's tough. You don't know if the person's ready to hear it. And if they're not ready to hear it, you don't know how they'll respond. But if they ask, if they say, hey, hon, how are things going? Is there anything I could do a little bit differently? Cautiously, carefully, I'm sure. But you're more likely to open up. And you're more likely to venture out with some candid conversation about what's going on because they've expressed a desire and an openness to hear. They've communicated that they're willing to listen. And you're making it that much easier for them to share. So be fair to your clients. Be kind to your clients. Give them the opportunity to tell their story to you, to talk about what their experience is like. The good news, and I've got the data on this, for every challenge a client might raise, there's over 5 successes that you didn't know about. It's really a very positive process. Asking can happen lots of ways. Ultimately, you've got to talk to your clients. Data helps. It's a good starting point to let you know when and where you need to have a conversation. But the data, the scores that you might get, they really don't matter. And most of the time, it's actually true. The scores really don't matter. The scores only matter as much as they help you tell when to engage with the client to understand the story. Any kind of formal feedback process should never replace client conversations. And a good feedback process will always start the conversations that need to happen. And it's these conversations with your clients that create the stories, and the stories, as we've already seen, create the outcomes that you're after. And these stories begin leading into learning how we as organizations can change and improve down to the very roots, how we do what we do every day. And for stories to help us learn, it's important to understand the 3 different levels of learning. The first kind is transmissional learning. That's what we're doing today. I'm sharing ideas and tips that you're absorbing, possibly writing down. I'm up here telling you stuff. I'm transmitting what I know, and I'm hoping that you'll begin to know some of it. And this is really the first level of learning. You nod your head, you capture a few notes, you get some bright ideas and inspirations, and most of the time, not much changes, not much happens. You'll leave this webinar, you'll attend 10 others, and your brain's going to fill up with all kinds of other stuff that will then soon be replaced by other stuff. And it's a cycle of transitory learning. The next level of learning is transactional. Transactional learning is when you begin to practice what you learn. You're transacting what you've acquired. You're actually doing it. But transactional learning still requires effort. It means that I, with intent and purpose, apply a technique or a lesson learned. You leave a sticky note on your screen. Make sure you do this every day. You've got a checklist. which begins to structure how you change your behaviors. And it's useful, and that's where most change in life actually happens, but it's slow, it's inconsistent, it takes effort. And trying to scale transactional learning across an organization can be really tough. You've got 100 people or 1,000 people, and you're trying to get them to change their behavior. You've all been there. You're going to find setbacks and frustrations, and it's going to require constant monitoring, measuring, management, leadership, accountability to keep everybody on track. Transformative learning, on the other hand, is different. Transformative learning looks something like this. Oh, do you think the caveman forgets about the round wheel tomorrow? The next time he needs to drag a mammoth across the steps, is he going to get halfway there and think, oh yeah, I forgot to put the round wheels on today. Let me pull over and change the wheels. Of course not. Transformative learning is the duh moment. This changes everything. The new way is so obvious, so perfectly better and intuitive, you never go back to the old way. You don't even have to think about it. You don't fall into the old habits when the discipline wanes or measurement stops. You do it the new way because it's the right way to do it. It's the natural way to do it. Imagine what your organizations could do and how your service delivery could improve if every one of your employees began to understand your clients like this. So how do we engage in transformative learning? Well, there's a lot of psychology behind the process and various perspectives on how to make that happen, but I'll put forth that stories can be a great source of transformative learning. Stories that give you context, meaning, and purpose to adopt new understandings and create a new perspective on how the world works. I'll share an example. Here's a story of a mid-sized civil engineering firm. And you're looking at feedback each one of their project managers has gathered from clients. On the right-hand side, you see the scale that was used, centered at met expectations. So every question to every answer is pre-answered met expectations, and the client drags it up or down to change the score. That's just how our system works, how we do it. And the bar graph here on the left reveals the results. The black bar shows the average score. The dark blue, the range of 25th to 75th percentile. And the light blue, the minimum to maximum. You see Chris up here at the top, Chris the project manager. Almost all of his scores in the exceptional range. Let's compare him with Dan down at the bottom. Neither one has a score below met expectations, so there's no problems anywhere in there. And your first reaction might be to praise Chris for his excellence. But look what happens when we compare the profitability on their projects. It seems that Dan has been very effective at understanding the value he creates for his clients and charging according to his value. He's running a 38% profit. The clients are getting exactly what they want, and Dan's converting that to effective margins for the business. Chris, however, has been uncertain about the value he creates. He's fearful that his clients will be unhappy, so he chronically goes above and beyond, spending time that's not in scope, failing to charge for change orders, and writing proposals that don't assume enough value will be created. So the story here is it's easy to get distracted by the data and lose sight of what's really happening in the business. And the story does have a happy ending. This is one of those transformative moments. All we had to do was show Chris this graph, and he had that oh moment. He immediately understood the story his clients were telling him, gave him the confidence he needed to know that he was creating value. He started writing better proposals. He had better fees. He charged for scope that wasn't included. He stopped doing stuff the clients didn't need or ask for. And would you know that 6 months later, he was running at almost 20% profit on his projects? And his feedback scores didn't really go down all that much. The clients still loved the work that Chris was doing. So Chris had a real oh moment. He had to understand the story. He had to understand the experience of the client and the value that he was creating in order to drive a better business decision for his firm. And this leads to one of the biggest aha moments I've had in the last 11 years doing this, and that's this idea that feedback is about the client. It's really not about you or your people. It's always telling you more about what's going on with the client than it ever will about yourself. You consider there's several dozen of you on this webinar today, and although you're each hearing the same presentation, your feedback will all be different. You'll each evaluate your experience with your own perceptions and interpretations. And I'll be asking for your feedback after this presentation. I'm going to get scores all across the board based on where you are, what you already know, and how you learn. And for me, the speaker, it's not about knowing that I'm going to get a 92% approval rating. It's really about understanding why each of you gave the score that you gave. A 92% approval rating doesn't enable me to take any real action. But talking to a handful of you about your experience, about what you loved, about what you loathed, and hearing the story behind why, that changes me. That helps me empathize with the different types of audience members, and it forces me not to discard the 8% who disapproved. And instead, I'm going to learn how to reach each of you where you are. So that's the value in turning this idea about where the feedback lies around. It gives you the tools to begin empathizing with the clients. I've talked a lot about storytelling. Let me tell you a couple of stories. Here's one from my world illustrating this same point a different way. I began an engagement with a large architecture firm and started out with a baseline survey of a few of their clients. The feedback came in overwhelmingly positive, but one stood out. One of their largest clients, a $5 million a year account, provided a low score regarding a concern about the fees. His comment highlighted a recent situation where a small change order resulted in a $3,000 bill for additional services. Put that in perspective. $5 million account was concerned about a $3,000 change. It's a fraction of a percent. Really? And that's the same thing my client said. So we took the conversation a bit deeper. Why did he complain about the change order? And after walking through the follow-up conversation, we discovered that this guy had authority over the budget, and any change orders had to go through his boss. It made this guy look bad. It gave him extra work to do. It made it seem like he wasn't managing the project on his end. And in the conversation that followed this feedback exchange, again, the feedback started the conversation, this client, actually suggested that the architecture firm increase their next proposal by about $100,000 to cover any contingencies that might have come through. You see, the design firm had assumed that this guy wanted the tightest, lowest number possible, when really what was most important to him wasn't the absolute lowest number, but a reduction in risk. He wanted predictability in his cost. And all of you are constantly faced with that when you're trying to put together a proposal. You've got to understand the client. Does the client value the lowest number on the table at the risk of possibly that number changing by the end of the project? Or does the client want a number that is less likely to change, which means you've got a larger contingency, which means it's probably a bigger number? So what happened in this case? They said, sure, we can absolutely do that. They finished up their year and didn't have to touch that contingency, which means it was just extra profit. But you know what? Everybody won. The architecture firm generated extra value for the shareholders. The client won because his risk was managed. And this story goes deeper. This became an internal example. They started talking about this amongst their staff, and they used it as an internal parable about how always understanding your client's real drivers matters. They now talk about how do you make your client look good in the course of the project. If you find a way to deliver that, you've got a loyal client for life. So the story gives us context to learn the lesson and a framework by which we can apply the lesson time and again in other places. This goes so much further than a low score on budget management would ever indicate. So the real purpose of framing feedback this way, the reason why we ask or talk about feedback being about the client instead of about yourself, is it helps us drive that client empathy. Let's say you get some challenging comments or conversation from a client, a problem pops up, and you go to your team and say, there's a client complaint. What did you do to cause that issue? That's maybe a rather brusque way to phrase it, but it doesn't really matter how you phrase it. You can ask as nicely as you want. If you ask the question in a way that's putting the team on the spot to say why they did what they did, their natural response, and the only answer option you've really given them is to be defensive, to defend why they did what they did. And they start arguing facts and figures and automatically dismiss the client's perceptions. It's not natural to accept criticism no matter how nicely framed. So instead of asking, what did you do to cause the issue, you change that question to, well, that's interesting. Why do you think the client said that? You've immediately redirected the conversation from the self and onto the client. You can't answer that question defensively. All your staff can do is pause, kind of scratch their head for a minute, and as they work to formulate an answer, why did the client say that? They have to empathize. You've just walked them right into this very effective zone of trying to get in the mind of the client. And your staff, all of a sudden, they have to tell the client's story. They got to figure out what the story is first, and that might mean they need to have some more conversation. But they've all of a sudden gotten in the client's mind, and they feel the client's experience. So I encourage you to practice this every day. When you're faced with any kind of feedback or information coming in, positive or challenging, ask the question, interesting. I wonder why she said that. Make this a part of your daily language, your lexicon. It's an inescapable question that forces the empathy and draws out the stories. If you really want to create a storytelling culture, start by asking that question. And when you really take it to the next level, you can keep the storytelling going by asking a second follow-up question. What do you think happens next? That question encourages your staff to really think through the scenarios, including how the client will respond in each. And by telling a future story of a positive outcome, we're now getting your staff committed to making that story happen. They've just envisioned the best possible future, and now they know the course of action and the steps to take to help make that imagined future a reality. And this goes one level deeper, because when you get your staff to say that they're going to go do something to create some outcome, there's some commitment psychology that's at play. By saying I'm going to go do it, or here's what I could go do, it's their plan, it's their action, it's their words, and they've already bought into it because it's theirs. And this commitment psychology applies to your clients as well. Here's another story. I was working with a very large energy engineering company, and they were working for a public utility, and they were in the midst of losing a multi-year, multi-million-dollar contract. Knowing there were problems, they'd been collecting data for about a year showing how unhappy the client was. And I do a lot of feedback and a lot of work across the industry. And honestly, it's just some of the most challenging feedback I've ever seen. Even worse, this firm had been told their contract was going to be terminated at the end of the year. Now, we all know you don't become a successful international engineering company by being bad at what you do. So I knew there had to be something more to the story. I start digging in to try to figure it out. And what I learned was that utility company had laid off all 200 of their staff engineers and outsourced it all to my client. And the people who were left at the utility, all those facilities operators and plant operators, they were just furious. All their friends got laid off. The real problem wasn't that my client couldn't perform, but that the utility people didn't want them to. It was politics, not performance. And until we dragged out that story, no solution was going to fix it. There was no way we were just going to engineer better or be more responsive or be more friendly and helpful. Once we understood the story, we knew what to do. We set about managing the perceptions directly. And the relationship was salvaged in 4 months. All the metrics came up, and in fact, they earned a 1-year extension to the contract. So how do we do that? How do you go about changing perceptions? Well, it's asking the right questions of the right people at the right time. Instead of asking the big, overall, how are things going, we started having the individual staff engineers get feedback from the individual task orders they were working on. This little thing to Bob, and this little thing to Sue, and this little thing over here to Joe. And by getting a client to say, yep, that worked, and that worked, and that worked, and that worked, that began playing with the idea of commitment psychology. And once all of the people inside the client organization started saying, yes, it's working at the micro scale, they could no longer say, no, it wasn't working at the macro scale. It was a pretty dramatic turnaround that really focused on what was happening based on their story. We knew we weren't going to be able to be the internal engineers, and we knew that we were unfairly being held as the bad guy for some executive decision and internal politics, so we had to use what we knew to really change the real problem. It's a complex story. If any of you have a really tough client who's in that situation and you want to know more, please let me know. I'll be more than happy to walk you through that. So when talking to clients to figure out what they want, it is important to distinguish between what they really want and what they ask for. I consider Ben Baldanza, the CEO of Spirit Airlines. Spirit's feedback scores are among the lowest in the industry. And yet Spirit is one of the most profitable and fastest growing airlines. Because Baldanza knows what his customers want, even if what they want isn't what they ask for. Spirit Airlines charges for everything, including carry-ons and even the water served on the flight. But these rules help Spirit deliver the lowest possible prices. And some customers want nothing more than to get somewhere cheaper. You see, Baldanza understands his customer stories. He knows there's an unemployed plumber whose mom gets sick and the plumber, barely able to pay the rent, just needs to get home to see his mom one more time. When being there to get home to mom matters more than anything else, including comfort, Spirit can get you there for the lowest possible cost. You have to have stories like this to stay focused on the mission. Otherwise, you might get distracted by conflicting information and lose focus on your purpose. I heard Baldanza in an interview on a Sunday morning on CBS, and he said the year of the customer, which is going on right now, is really about aligning the customer expectation to the reality of what they're going to get. You see, what Baldanza realized is even though everybody wants first class, or everybody asks for first class, what a lot of people want is the lowest possible price. So what he's doing is rather than giving in and giving more leg room and removing the fees and becoming just another low margin, unprofitable airline like all the others, he's really focusing on the real problem, setting and managing expectations better. And he's able to drive a better experience by better managing the expectations and really delivering what people actually want. Now, Baldanza isn't the first to do this. Henry Ford famously said, if I asked people what they wanted, they would have asked for faster horses. Think about your smartphones from 10 years ago. Everyone was building what customers asked for. On one hand, the BlackBerry with their great little keyboards, and the other, the Windows Phone and the stylus. The market was full of them. That's what everybody asked for. Then along comes Steve Jobs, and master at knowing what people actually want, even when they don't know what to ask for. And it brings out the iPhone, all touch, no keyboard, no stylus, and it revolutionized mobile telephony. Go find a phone today with a physical keyboard. It's almost impossible to do. Go try to find a BlackBerry. Good luck. So what you see here is that understanding the client, when you know their stories, you're empowered to create better products, better services that your clients actually want, even if it's not what they asked for, because you're going beyond the ask and into understanding the need. So how do you really do this and start finding out what's really happening with your clients? It all comes down to getting some feedback. Get feedback early. Why do you want to get feedback early? Because your clients understand that the end of the project is too late. There's no incentive for them to respond because it's already over. What can you do? Get feedback early enough, and they know they can tell you their story, and their story will affect the outcome of the project. And then get feedback often enough during the course of the project or the client relationship so that you can stay on track. You know what? People's stories change. Their world changes. You need to be in constant communication with them in an open and clear dialogue so you can stay in sync with what's happening. You got to involve the right people. The right people, at the end of the day, are the people doing the work for the client. The only one who can change the outcome for a client is the person serving the client. Often that's the project manager or the project architect or engineer. If you're in the legal space, sometimes a paralegal. One of those people sitting there on the front line talking to the clients every day. They're the ones who can make changes. So involve them in the conversations. Don't worry about the scores. If you do any kind of formal feedback, don't get distracted by the scores. But instead, use the scores to start the conversations, use the conversations to discover the stories. And when your clients do respond, when they do give you some information, when they tell you what their story is, follow up instantly. Let the client know you heard them, you understand, and show them how their story is going to change your process. And the good news is feedback works almost automatically. When a client responds, when you start to understand their story a little bit, you can't unhear it. It's like one of those songs. I said earlier, I've got daughters. That stupid song from Frozen that is stuck in my head. I will never be able to let it go. Years from now, I'll be in the shower, and it's going to pop in there, and I can't unhear that song. It has changed the biology and physiology of my brain. It's stuck. The same thing happens with your clients. When your clients give you some feedback, when you hear their story, It's really hard to forget. And because you now know it, it's hard to not be changed or impacted by it. But you can take this one step further. It's not just about asking and hearing the stories. It's about following up. And what we found, when you take specific action, when you capture a response strategy to a client, I just got their story, I just heard what they were saying, and here's what I did about it, we've been able to measure an 83% reduction in repeat client problems. What this means is, when you find out from a client that there's a problem, and you understand the story behind what's going on, and you tell the client, got it, here's what I now understand, and here's what I'm going to do differently about it. The rate of the client identifying a future problem is 83% lower than the control group that doesn't take any formal action on this. What's happening is your client now knows, they now trust that you get them. And they don't have to wait for you to ask. They don't have to make it this big thing. You've built credibility that you're going to take their information, you're going to hear their story, you're going to respond empathetically, and do something useful with the information. So your clients will start telling you stuff. It creates this amazing bridge of communication that didn't exist before. So when you go out to seek these conversations, it's important, if you're doing any kind of formal feedback, to keep it short, simple, and nuanced. Again, we're just trying to get to the story. We're just trying to start a conversation and stimulate some insight into what's happening in the client's mind. It doesn't take 57 questions in 20 minutes to pull that off. The shortest, simplest ask you can do to get the conversation started is typically all you need to do. If any of you would like a guide or samples of how to write some great questions, do let me know. We'll certainly share a white paper with you on how to do that. And when you do ask those questions, you want to make sure you're measuring the right thing. You got to measure the stuff the client wants to talk about. And you know what? The client doesn't want to talk about you. It's tough to talk about people. The client really wants to talk about the process. Because right now they're kind of stuck with you, at least until this project's over, and people are really hard to change, and you know that and they know that. So talking about you isn't really all that helpful. Talking about the process, well, that's a pretty useful thing to do, because we can change the process, we can tweak the process, we can draw the process on a whiteboard, and we can see how the process integrates into the client's story. So when you do seek feedback, whether it's on a survey form or a phone conversation or face-to-face, try to make it really easy on the client by asking about the processes rather than people. Really tough to sit down across the table from a client and say, hey, do you like me? There's no good way to answer that question. So instead, redirect them towards the process. And what you'll find is when you do this well, you'll start some incredible conversations. Here's yet another storytelling webinar, so I'm going to tell lots of them here. I was working with an engineering firm on the West Coast, and long-term client, the very first time they sent a formal survey to the client replied and said, I don't want to take your survey, but can we sit down together and talk? I've got some things I'd like to say. Oh, fantastic. It started a conversation. So this project manager and the client, they went out to lunch, they broke some bread together, and they engaged in a really effective discovery about what was going on. The project manager was able to show his care and compassion for the client and the client's needs and challenges and problems. And the client was so impressed at this formal approach to reaching out and putting his needs first, the client offered the project manager 2 additional projects on the spot without having to go through a formal RFP process. And this client organization almost always went through a formal RFP process. It was amazing how connected they felt coming out of that conversation. And when you start doing this well, you can begin to share the stories you've gathered with others. Here's an example grabbed from a website of Transpo Group. They've actually collected over 2,400 client responses, each one of them a snapshot of the client story. And with the metrics and the data, they've been able to put right there on their website, here's what our clients are saying about us. They're showing the world that they get the client experience. They get the client story. Got another example here of a firm who builds this right into their proposals. So they're actually showing their clients that they have a care to get the story. We have a process for getting feedback from you so that we can understand what matters to you and be responsive to it. So you can use this storytelling culture not just to gather stories, but to share them. You can share the data, you can share your process of capturing stories, and you can tell great stories. The final story I'll tell today comes from an engineering firm in Kansas City. One of their divisions has a team of about 30 or so people, and they get it. From the first day, we helped them get started with the client feedback program. They made storytelling part of their staff meetings. Every time they get together, they share stories. They talk about what one client said and why she said it, and as a group, they seek to understand what's going on. What are the principles behind the story? They laugh, they ask questions, they expand the stories to other situations, and they're all learning from it internally. So they've set up this culture of telling travel stories, and they were really intentional about it. They dedicate time to the art of storytelling. And a couple of years later, their business is stronger and growing faster and better than before. And when all of your staff have these stories, not only do they have some purpose and meaning behind what they do every day, but they've got stories they can share externally. So the next time one of those engineers is at a conference or at a networking function, and someone asks, what is it you do? Instead of saying, we're a multidiscipline, da-da-da-da-da-da, and everybody tunes out, they can share a story. Yeah, I just helped a company like this accomplish this thing they were trying to do, and really, it was kind of cool. And they're telling a story, and people relate, and it becomes an incredible business development tool. So what lessons did I learn and I apply from all these client stories? I've shared a lot of my own stories from my experience here. We've done the same thing that firm in Kansas City did. We have a designated story time on my team. We've got a weekly team meeting on Mondays, and we open up the floor every Monday to say, hey, anybody hear a cool client story? Anybody learn something from a client? And we actually have a story repository where we capture these things and document them. And our sales team, our marketing, operations, our project managers, everybody uses that information to change and impact how they do what they do and why they do it every day. It begins to affect all kinds of things. We've got a software product, and we don't have a feature list. We've got a story list. Everything we build, it has a story. Someone needs it for some reason, and here's why. And if you don't have a who, a what, and a why, you don't have a story. You don't have a feature. So it really begins to focus everything we do as an organization. So we sell with stories, we market with stories, we implement, we operate, we deliver with stories. And because of that, we tend to stay pretty focused on what our clients really need and how we can really help them. And you can too. You can implement stories as a key part of your organizational development and your culture and your staff training and your marketing and your business development. And your whole organization will get better because of it. So what stories matter to you? Can you tell a good story about a client? That's a challenge I'm going to leave you with. I challenge you to listen for some stories. I challenge you to go ask and try to find out the stories. And I challenge you to share the stories and start creating that tradition of storytelling inside your organization. That concludes the webinar today. I appreciate all of your time. Are there any questions at this point? I'd like to be able to answer a few of those. Let me see. First, let me jump in and say a few of you did post a couple other stories. One of you jumped in here and said the Challenger in the sky. Wow, certainly a great memory and impactful story. I certainly recall where I was sitting that day when that happened and how it made me feel. Let's see, I've got a good question here. When listening to a client's story and a story of my own comes to mind, how do I keep from hogging the stage? Oh, that's a great question, and I may not be the best person to answer that question. I'm a bit of a stage hog myself. I would suggest if you can share a story about another client like the client who's talking, that's a great opportunity to take the stage a little bit. When you can share a story that shows you understand this situation as a type and you've related to it similarly with another client who's kind of like the one you're talking to, that shows some experience and wisdom, that should be a value-added conversation. That's a really good question. Do make sure you spend more time listening than you do telling, and as you are telling the story, I would watch for and read the body language. Are they nodding? Are they getting it? Let them expand upon the story so it becomes, yeah, that's kind of like what I'm dealing with. And if you hear that piece, then it certainly makes sense to keep on going with that story. Looks like there's a question here. Should the storyteller be asked to sign a consent form? I'm guessing that means something about permission. If you are telling a specific client's story and you're referencing that client by name, particularly if it's a public sector agency, I would certainly encourage you to get permission to tell that story. However, I think you can tell the stories as a type pretty easily and pretty openly as long as there's no uniquely identifying information in there. So that's a balance line you're going to have to figure out for your particular organization. If you can anonymize the story enough to be comfortable and safe, then certainly tell the story. Internally, I imagine you've got a lot more freedom to cite very specific examples rather than a general one. Not seeing any other questions at this time, so it looks like we're going to be wrapping up a little bit early. Those of you who might have heard some information here that is particularly interesting and you want to dig in deeper to how do you really set this up, how do you go about finding and gathering and telling these stories, I'm going to be delivering a one-day workshop in Dallas, Texas, the afternoon of May 18th and morning of the 19th. If you are interested in getting more information about that, do let us know. My email address is on the screen. We'll also be sending you a feedback survey, and you can annotate in there that you'd like more information on that opportunity. And as I just said, we will be asking for your feedback, so please do look for that in the coming day or so. Do know that if you respond, we're going to follow our best practice, and we will follow up, respond to you, most likely via email, unless there's a phone conversation warranted, and we'll get you whatever information you need, and recognize that we've heard your voice. All feedback is important to us, and we do want to recognize and thank you for it. So let's see. Actually, it does appear that there's a couple more questions that have come in. What are the best questions to ask when learning the client's story? What is the best way to share these stories? Another very good question there. I do have a white paper available on how to ask great questions. So if you would like that, I do let me know, and I'll get that to you. To summarize, I mentioned earlier, let's focus on process-based questions rather than fact-based questions. If it's a fact-based question, if it's something knowable, you probably should already know it. Things like, was the project delivered on schedule? You mean you don't know that you were 3 weeks late? Very different question than, say, how well does our process manage the project schedule? So you can start asking process-based questions. That would avoid multiple choice, a yes, no, leave room for a lot of the nuance to happen in there. And then as you discover stuff, the best way, I think, is staff meetings. When you're around people and you have an opportunity to have a little bit of a conversation, share the story during a staff meeting, during a planning session if you need to. At the water cooler in the break room, it's a great way to practice telling some stories. Find a peer that you can share them with. When you really get good and sophisticated at it, I would encourage you to start capturing them as concisely as you can. A quarter page to half a page of writing. Share those on a private intranet inside the organization. Send an email to the team. Those can be great ways to not just share them, but capture the stories as well. Let's see, there's a question here. We find solutions, but this means explaining negative problems that needed to be solved. Is presenting negativity bad? I'm going to try to interpret that question here. Technically, professionally, if a client asks for something that isn't feasible, isn't practical, can't be done, or maybe the client is asking for two things that are in opposition to each other, that does happen at times. I would get out of the mindset of presenting negativity and instead talk about options. If you go into a conversation assuming negativity, or assuming that an option or a conversation is going to be challenging, I think your approach to it tends to be more timid, which means you're overly cautious, which probably leads the client to feeling like you're holding back or not being fully straightforward. So asking some good questions of the client around what they're really trying to accomplish. Usually their goals are positive, and any negative information, any problems, are just possible impediments to helping them reach that goal. If you've discovered a problem that perhaps you or your team have created, the best way to handle that, I think, is to be very straightforward and really phrase it in the construct of, we found a potential impediment to reaching your goal. let me make sure I understand and restate what the goal is. Here's something we found or we created. And we want to talk about how to get this impediment out of the way to help you to reach the goal. And all of a sudden, you're aligning with the client. And the client's going to have a hard time arguing or complaining if you're showing that you're aligned with his goal. So if you get stuck in facts, you can discuss facts and debate facts and really create an environment of conflict. If you stay focused on goals, it's much easier to get towards alignment. So that's how I would encourage you to address negativity. So good. I'm glad to see a couple other questions rolled in. It does look like all the questions have been posed and answered now. We are still ahead of schedule, so glad to say you've got an extra 12 minutes to your day. Those of you that stuck around, I certainly appreciate it. And again, I do look for the feedback requests coming from us, and if there's any of the resources I offered, we have the white paper on how to ask great questions. We have a guide on how to test or implement a feedback process to start gathering stories. We're certainly more than happy to share those with you as well. And of course, there is the day-long workshop I mentioned if you really want to dig into this stuff a lot deeper. Thanks again. I appreciate your time and hope you have a wonderful afternoon.